Chapter 9. He Goes to Court. It was 5 days till Monday, and Little John dreaded it more each day. The phone rang almost constantly at first. Cars filled with curious people began to creep along the road. To escape prying neighbors and the probability of more reporters, he and Thomas spent long hours at the cave. None of this helped his memory. When Monday finally came, Thomas and Mary took him to the courthouse in the center of town and tried unsuccessfully to slip through the rear entrance without being noticed. A lurking photographer spotted them. Suddenly, 2 cameras were flashing, and they were surrounded by a small crowd of ogling townspeople. Thomas thrust through into the hall, where they were rescued by a policeman. "In yonder, Mr. Bean," said the policeman, pointing to a door. "Back, everybody. You know these hearings are private." "Hey, Mr. Bean," a man called. "Can that kid really jump 100 feet?" The door closed behind them, shutting out the racket. Thomas, Little John saw, had timed their arrival carefully. The others were all present, sitting in a semicircle of newly varnished chairs facing a desk. The small room seemed overflowing with 8 other people besides himself and the Beans. As he sat down on one side between Thomas and Mary, he could feel every eye upon him. Angus Macklin and his 2 boys were sitting over on his left. Angus was smiling, and Tip and Linny looked stubbornly defiant. Gilby and Emma Pitts were behind them. Anderson Bush, his hands full of papers, was talking in a low voice to a large, square-faced woman in the corner. With the woman was a long-nosed man in glasses. The man seemed aloof and officious. Little John glanced uneasily at the square-faced woman. She kept staring at him as if he were something unpleasant. Mary whispered, "That's Mrs. Groom. She's in charge of welfare. The man with her is Mr. McPhee, the probation officer." The door on the other side of the desk opened, and a respectful hush fell over the room. Miss Josie entered. Miss Josie was small, gray, and precise. There was no nonsense about her, but behind her quiet, thoughtful eyes Little John sensed all the qualities of a friend. As she took her seat, she smiled quickly at Thomas and Mary. "I've been wanting to visit the rock shop again, Thomas, but I haven't had time lately." Thomas was already on his feet. "Miss Josie," he said, thrusting a folded sheet of paper across her desk, "before this thing gets any more out of hand, there are some points that I feel you, and you alone, should know about. I've jotted them down here." "Thank you, Thomas." Miss Josie smoothed the paper out on her desk and quietly surveyed the room. "Why are you here, Gilby?" Gilby Pitts gave a nervous twitch of his high shoulder. "Me and Emma are witnesses, Miss Josie. I got charge of Dr. Holliday's place, where all them things was stolen, and we seen that wild boy when he—" "That's enough, Gilby." Miss Josie's voice had the sting of a whip. "You'll not use that expression in this room. If you are called upon to say anything, you'll stick to the facts and facts only, and you'll not repeat them when you leave here." She turned to Anderson Bush. "Mr. Bush, I've been back in town for 3 hours, and I've heard nothing but preposterous gossip about this case. Juvenile cases of this nature are not for the public. When children get in trouble, they need help, not foolish gossip and publicity. Yet I find our town full of talk, and the courthouse full of curious people. It's disgraceful and disgusting." The deputy's face had darkened, but he said smoothly, "I'm sorry, Miss Josie, but the talk had already started before I entered the case. Naturally, when someone catches a strangely dressed boy trespassing under the, most unusual circumstances, and then discovers that there's been a robbery—" "Let's not waste time, Mr. Bush," she interrupted. "You were ordered to investigate a simple matter of breaking and entering and theft, obviously committed by 1 or more boys. Stick to that and tell me exactly what you learned about it." Anderson Bush began. He told of Gilby Pitt's discovery of the forced window in the Holiday house, the small footprints inside, the missing articles, and their high value. Then he related what Gilby had told him about catching a strangely dressed boy in the field. The deputy paused and said, "Dr. Holliday's place is only 300 yards from the spot where Mr. Pitts caught this boy Saturday morning. It was Monday morning before the theft was discovered, and naturally our suspicions centered on this strange boy. I'd like to read you a description of that boy as I got it from Mr. and Mrs. Pitts, and tell you a few facts about him I've uncovered. "That's unnecessary at the moment," Miss Josie said. "Confine yourself to the theft." The deputy shrugged. Yes, ma'am. As I was saying, this strange boy seemed the logical suspect. All the same, I investigated 3 possible subjects in Mr. Pitt's area and checked them out. That left only the boys living in Mr. Bean's valley. Now, there's a gap behind the holiday place, which makes it an easy hike from one valley to the other if you know the way. I know about the gap, said Miss Josie. I've lived in this country 64 years. Proceed. Well, on Mr. Bean's side, there's only Mr. Bean's boy, and this, strange boy he has with him, and the 2 Macklin boys up the road. I checked out the 2 Macklin boys. Witnesses prove they were away all Saturday and Sunday, which is the only period the theft could have happened. I also checked. Pardon me, said Thomas. You are leaving out something, Mr. Bush. I told you Tuesday night what Mr. Macklin told Mrs. Bean and me at the shop, that his boys had been out all Sunday afternoon looking for that strange boy. Angus burst out. I never said no such a thing. We were at Blue Lake. Quiet, both of you, Miss Josie ordered. Mr. Bush, did you check a second time at Blue Lake and get the names of those witnesses? I did, ma'am. Mr. Macklin and his family were visiting a Mr. and Mrs. Hinckley all Sunday afternoon. The Hinckley's swear to it. Mr. Bush, said Miss Josie, did you know that Joe Hinckley and Angus Macklin were half-brothers? Anderson Bush stiffened. No, ma'am. It takes time to learn all these local relationships, and you've been here only 5 years. Proceed with your story. Well, ma'am, as I was saying, I checked out Mr. Bean's boy, Brooks. That left only Mr. Bean's visitor, this boy he calls John O'Connor. When I questioned him about John O'Connor, Mr. Bean was very evasive. He told me that John O'Connor was the orphaned son of Captain James O'Connor of the Marines, who was killed recently in North Africa. He said further that the Marines had brought John O'Connor to his house Saturday evening, and that the boy could have had nothing to do with the theft. Yet Tuesday evening, Mr. Pitt saw this John O'Connor and positively identified him as the strange boy he had caught in his field. Later, Mrs. Pitts identified him as the same boy. The Beans had changed his clothes and cut his hair to make him look more normal. But he's the same sneaky boy, Emma Pitts exclaimed. I'd know him anywhere. He ain't natural. Quiet, Emma, Miss Josie snapped. Be careful what you say in here. Mr. Bush, this is all very interesting about John O'Connor, but at the moment we are concerned only with the theft. I understand that the stolen articles were recovered that very evening when you took Mr. Bean over to the Macklins. Tell us about that. Yes, ma'am, the deputy pointed to a table in the corner. On it were 2 fishing rods, a tackle box, and a rifle. Those are the articles, ma'am. When we got to the Macklins, Mr. Bean insisted he'd seen the Macklin boys crossing their pasture, carrying what appeared to be the stolen things. He also insisted that Tip and Lenny were going to hide the things over in Johnson's woods so they wouldn't be found on their own place. The deputy paused. Well, said Miss Josie. It was a pretty dark night, said Anderson Bush. I've got good vision, but I didn't see Tip and Lenny crossing the pasture. However, Mr. Bean insisted that we immediately search the edge of the woods. We started across the pasture and met Tip and Lenny returning. That struck me as rather odd, and I didn't get an explanation out of them till later. Anyway, I searched the edge of the woods very carefully and found nothing. The deputy stopped again and glanced at Little John. Go on, said Miss Josie. Who found the things? Mr. Bean and that boy yonder did. They found them in less than 5 minutes. The articles were hidden far back under a cedar clump where they couldn't have been seen even in daylight. It would have been almost impossible to find them at night unless you knew exactly where they were. Were there fingerprints on them, Mr. Bush? Yes, ma'am. The fingerprints belonged to Tip and Lenny. When I questioned the Macklins about it afterward, they finally said their boys had found the stolen articles during the afternoon when they were playing in the woods. They'd taken them to the barn. Mr. Macklin says when he learned about it, he made the boys return the things to the Cedars and hide them exactly as they'd found them. He says he was afraid they might be accused of the theft if they reported it. Miss Josie asked, Did you find any of John O'Connor's fingerprints on the stolen articles? No, ma'am, but they could easily have been rubbed off by so much handling from other people. Did you find John O'Connor's fingerprints in the Holiday House? No, ma'am. I did find Tip and Lenny's prints in there, but Mr. Pitts tells me the boys had been in the house a number of times. The doctor had them do odd jobs about the place. I see. Now, what have you learned about John O'Connor? Anderson Bush smiled. There is no such person, Miss Josie. I checked with the Marines. It is true that there was a Captain O'Connor, that he was Mr. Bean's friend, and that he was killed recently, but he had no children. Very well, said Miss Josie. That states things clearly. Thomas, what have you to say? Thomas Bean swallowed. It's true that I lied to Mr. Bush, but I had good reasons, Miss Josie. Before I try to explain, I wish you'd read those notes I gave you. They'll prepare you. Little John clutched his arm. Please, not yet. Miss Josie, he spoke earnestly. Before you read that, will you let me say something first? She nodded. Yes, John, we want to hear your side of it. Little John took a long breath. This was not going to be easy. Because of Anderson Bush, he was forced to say and do certain things he abhorred, but if only for Thomas's sake, he had to go through with it. Miss Josie, he began, Mr. Bean had been trying to protect me ever since he found me Saturday evening over a week ago. I cannot remember anything that happened before that day. I had been in some kind of accident, for I was badly bruised, and I was frightened because I didn't know what had happened or where I was, except that I was somewhere on a strange mountain. I followed a doe and her fawn down to Mr. Pitt's field, trying to find someone to help me. Mr. Pitts tried to kill the doe, but I spoiled his aim and— That's a lie, Gilby cried. I never shot at no doe. Gilby, Miss Josie said icily, hold your tongue or it will give me great pleasure to fine you. John, please continue. Mr. Pitts caught me, but after Mrs. Pitts came, I broke away and ran. I wandered all day through the mountains until I came out on the road where Mr. Bean found me. John, said Miss Josie, during your wanderings that day, did you find the holiday house and enter it? No, ma'am, I haven't seen the place. Besides, I was looking for someone to help me. Little John smiled. I would hardly have expected to find any help in 2 fishing rods, a heavy tackle box, and a rifle. I knew nothing about such things at the time, and I couldn't have carried them if I'd wanted to. I needed a stick to walk. He paused to plan his next move. Over in the corner, he saw Mr. McPhee, the long-nosed probation officer, whistle softly and shake his head. I've heard some wild ones in my day, McPhee said under his breath to Mrs. Groom, but this kid's tale has 'em all beat. Mr. McPhee, Miss Josie said coldly, keep your opinions to yourself. John, you've just told me you knew nothing of fishing rods and rifles. For a boy of today, I find that a very strange statement. I'm sure you do, Miss Josie, but it's true. You see, John, she asked suddenly, how old are you? I don't know, ma'am. She studied him a moment, puzzled, then said, Well, continue your story. That's about all, Miss Josie, except for finding the stolen things. After being taken to Mr. Macklin's house that night, I knew exactly where they were. Miss Josie raised her eyebrows. You did? Yes, ma'am. Here is how I knew. Will you think of a number, Miss Josie? I believe it will be better if you think of a large one. Very well, I've thought of it. What about it? The number you are thinking of is 3,740,976. Miss Josie opened her mouth, closed it, then sat perfectly motionless while she looked at him. The room had become deathly still. Little John said, I'm not sure my pronunciation is right. I haven't known English very long, and Mrs. Bean has had so much trouble with people interrupting her lately that she hasn't had time to teach me certain things. Is the number I gave correct? She nodded, her lips compressed. Do you want to try another number, Miss Josie, or something else? It isn't necessary, she answered, almost in a whisper. It's obvious, John, that you can read my thoughts. Yes, Miss Josie. It is very unpleasant to have to tell you this, but the thoughts of everyone in this room are so loud right now that they might just as well be shouting. So how can I help but know what the Macklins have done? I don't believe it, Anderson Bush grated. This smooth-talking kid is full of more lies than any kid I ever— Please, Mr. Bush, Little John said quickly before Miss Josie could speak. I'd rather not have to say any more, but if you won't take numbers for proof, I'll have to convince you another way. Years ago, you were in the Army. You were ordered to drive a truck somewhere. On the way, you had a bad accident. Little John swallowed hard. Must I tell what you did and what happened to you afterward? The deputy's jaws were knotted. His face had paled. No, he said hoarsely. I've heard enough. He glared at Angus Macklin. What about it, Macklin? Have you been stringing me along all this time? No, honest, I ain't. Angus had lost his smile. His hands were shaking. My boys wouldn't... The deputy snapped. You crazy fool, this kid really is a mind reader. Don't you realize what that means? You can't keep a secret from him. Nobody can. Emma Pitt suddenly cried. I told you that kid's unnatural. Let me out of here. I don't want nothing to do with no mind reader. She and Gilby were on their feet backing away. There was fear in their faces. The room was in an uproar. From somewhere in a drawer, Miss Josie produced a gavel. She pounded it vigorously on the desk. Sit down, she ordered. Quiet, all of you. When the room was restored to order, she said, Angus Macklin, I've known you all my life, and I happen to remember things about you I'll not mention here. Let's have the truth. Did Tip and Lenny break into the holiday place and take those things? Angus swallowed and nodded. Yes, ma'am. Where did they hide them? In the barn at first, then I got to worrying about it and had 'em take the things over in the cedars. I see. You thought all the blame would fall on this strange boy everyone was talking about. Angus, this is a very serious matter. The value of those stolen articles is over $500. I want you and Tip and Lenny to go home and think about how serious it is. Tomorrow I have a full day, but Wednesday I want you all back here at 10 o'clock, and I'll decide what to do about you. I'm afraid Tip and Lenny are badly in need of corrective measures. You, Angus, could be prosecuted. She turned and glanced at Mrs. Groom and Mr. McPhee. Does what I'm doing meet with your approval? Mr. McPhee nodded. Mrs. Groom started to speak, then nodded also. Miss Josie said, All right, Angus, you and the boys may go. Gilby, you and Emma may go. But let me warn all of you not to say one word of what you've heard in this room this morning. When they were gone, it was Mrs. Groom who spoke first. Miss Josie, she began disapprovingly, I don't know what to make of this boy. He may be a mind reader, but I'm not at all convinced he isn't a delinquency case himself. He sounds entirely too clever to be up to any good. Furthermore, if he's really lost his memory and doesn't know where his home is, he's a welfare case, and I should be the one to handle him. She looked coldly at Thomas. Mr. Bean, I think you've taken a lot on yourself. Why didn't you come to me in the first place when you found this boy? Thomas said, Mrs. Groom, I did what I thought was best for John. If Miss Josie will read what I've written for her, I'm sure she will agree with me. Suddenly, little John found Miss Josie smiling at him. He smiled back, loving her. I think you'll find it easier to understand now, Miss Josie, he said.